My name is Jacob Carter. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Spokane, Washington. I manage inventory at a regional warehouse that supplies everything from plumbing fixtures to power tools. It's the kind of job most people stop asking about after the first sentence. Most days, I count shipments, track missing orders, and solve problems that can be fixed with labels, shelves, and a barcode scanner. I like knowing where things belong. People are harder. 3 years ago, my divorce turned my quiet apartment into a place I only slept in. I got used to eating leftovers straight from the microwave, watching old home renovation shows, and falling asleep before the credits rolled. I wasn't unhappy exactly. Just predictable. The kind of man whose phone stayed silent after 8 o'clock. The kind of man who started talking to the cashier at the grocery store a little longer than necessary. My cousin Olivia called me out on it one Sunday afternoon. "You need to stop acting like your life ended at 30, she said. I laughed. She didn't. 2 weeks later, she'd arranged a blind date with a woman named Sophie Bennett. "She's smart, funny, and way too good for you," Olivia told me. "So try not to wear that expression you make when you're checking inventory." I have an inventory expression? You absolutely do. Friday night, I drove to Birchwood Cafe 15 minutes early. I wore the nicest flannel shirt I owned and a pair of jeans without paint stains or warehouse dust. The place was crowded. Couples sat shoulder to shoulder in corner booths. Friends laughed over half-finished desserts. The espresso machine hissed constantly behind the counter. I ordered black coffee and checked my phone. 7 o'clock. 7:08. 7:14. No message. By 7:21, I'd already typed out a text to Olivia. "I think your friend changed her mind. No hard feelings. I'm heading home." My thumb hovered over the send button. Then the cafe door opened. A woman stepped inside. She looked like she'd been running through the cold. Dark curls framed her face. A wool coat hung loosely from one shoulder. Her breathing was uneven, but her eyes were focused. Searching. Until they landed on me. She walked straight toward my table. No hesitation. No smile of recognition. Just certainty. She sat down across from me without taking off her coat. Without ordering. Without apologizing for being late. Then she leaned forward. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know who you are." I froze. She smiled. But her eyes were filling with tears. And I had absolutely no idea who she was. The strange part wasn't that she knew my name. It was that she knew things about me no stranger should know. For a few seconds, I didn't move. The cafe kept going around us like nothing strange had happened. Cups clinked against saucers. Someone laughed too loudly near the window. The espresso machine screamed behind the counter. Outside, headlights passed across the glass in long white streaks. But at my table, everything had gone still. The woman sitting across from me kept her hands folded around the strap of her purse, like she was trying to hold herself together. She was younger than I expected. Early 30s maybe. Soft brown eyes. Dark curls loosened by the cold. A face that looked calm only because it had practiced being calm. I glanced down at my phone. Then back at her. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "You're Sophie?" She nodded. "Sophie Bennett." The name meant nothing to me. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Because she was looking at me like my face carried a memory I had somehow misplaced. "You said you know who I am," I said. Her smile trembled a little. "I do." "From where?" She looked down at the table, then at the coffee in front of me. "Black. No sugar. No cream." "You still drink it plain," she said quietly. A cold feeling moved through my chest. I hadn't told Olivia how I took my coffee. At least, I didn't think I had. Maybe she had mentioned it. Maybe this woman was nervous and trying too hard. Maybe I was reading into something that wasn't there. That was what I told myself. Because the alternative felt too strange. I leaned back slightly. "Did Olivia tell you that?" Sophie shook her head. "No." The answer was too quick. Too certain. The waitress came by then, smiling with a small notepad in her hand, saving me from having to respond. "Can I get you something?" Sophie didn't look at the menu. "Mint tea, please." Then she turned back to me. I know this is uncomfortable. That almost made me laugh. Uncomfortable was waiting 20 minutes for a blind date who didn't show. Uncomfortable was sitting alone in a crowded cafe while couples around you made plans for next weekend. Uncomfortable was realizing your cousin had pity-arranged your Friday night because she thought your apartment was slowly swallowing you whole. This was different. This was a stranger sitting across from me with tears in her eyes, talking like she had been carrying my name for years. I looked toward the door once. Not because I wanted to leave. Because part of me needed to remember that I could. My cousin told me this was a blind date, I said. So I'm trying to understand why it feels like you already knew I would be here. Sophie pressed her lips together. I did know. The words landed between us. Not loud. Not dramatic. But heavy. I thought about my life. My ordinary, quiet, forgettable life. I woke up at 5:45 every morning. Showered. Made toast. Drove 17 minutes to the warehouse. Checked incoming shipments. Signed delivery forms. Corrected mistakes other people made because it was easier than arguing about them. Ate lunch in my truck when the break room got too loud. After work, I went home. Most evenings, I heated whatever I had cooked badly 2 days earlier. Sometimes chicken. Sometimes pasta. Sometimes something that had started with ambition and ended in a plastic container. I paid my bills on time. Changed my oil before the warning light came on. Remembered birthdays if my phone reminded me early enough. There was nothing mysterious about me. Nothing worth searching for. After my divorce, people had tried to comfort me by saying things like, "You'll find someone when you're ready," or, "At least you don't have kids caught in the middle," as if loneliness was easier when no one else could see it. They meant well. People usually do. But after a while, I stopped telling them I was fine and simply became the kind of fine they didn't question. That was why I didn't date much. Not because I hated love. Because I knew what it felt like to build a life with someone and then watch them quietly remove themselves from it, one drawer, one toothbrush, one framed photograph at a time. So when Olivia pushed me into this blind date, I had agreed mostly to make her stop worrying. I hadn't expected anything. I definitely hadn't expected this. Sophie watched my face carefully. You used to drive a blue Ford pickup, she said. My fingers tightened around my mug. It was a small detail. But it hit me harder than the coffee. Lots of people drive trucks. Not with a dent over the left rear wheel and a cracked passenger mirror held on with black tape. I stopped breathing for a moment. That truck had been gone for years. I sold it after the divorce because keeping it felt like keeping a version of myself I no longer knew what to do with. Who told you that? I asked. No one. My voice came out lower than I meant it to. Sophie. She flinched slightly at the seriousness in my tone, but she didn't look away. I promise I'm not trying to scare you. You're doing a strange job of it. That almost pulled a smile from her. Almost. The waitress returned with her tea. Sophie thanked her softly, then waited until she left before speaking again. You volunteer at the Christmas toy drive every December, she said. But you don't put your name on the list. You just show up early, unload boxes, fix broken donation bins, and leave before anyone takes pictures. I stared at her. That was not something Olivia knew. Nobody knew that. At least, nobody who mattered. I had started doing it years ago after the warehouse donated extra shelving to a community center. I went once to help with deliveries and kept going back because there was something peaceful about work no one thanked you for. No awkward conversations. No spotlight. Just boxes, tools, and a room slowly becoming useful. How do you know that? I asked. Sophie's eyes glistened again. Because 8 years ago, you did something like that for me. The cafe noise seemed to fall away. 8 years ago. I searched my memory, but nothing came easily. 8 years ago, I was still married. Still driving the blue truck. Still believing my life was heading in a direction I understood. What happened? I asked. Sophie looked like she had prepared for that question 100 times. And now that it had arrived, she didn't know how to answer. There was a storm, she said. A storm? Snow. Black ice. A road outside Cardialine. I was 23, and I thought I had already had the worst day of my life. Her voice thinned. Then the car went off the road. Something moved at the edge of my memory. Not a full picture. More like a flash. Dark road. Hazard lights. Cold air. A woman's voice shaking. But it was gone before I could hold it. Sophie saw the change in my face. "You don't remember," she whispered. "I remember pieces," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. She nodded like she had expected that. Like part of her had been afraid of it. "That's okay," she said. "For you, maybe it was just one night." Her fingers tightened around the teacup. For me, it became the night I measured everything else against. I didn't know what to say to that. There are compliments that make you feel good. And then there are words that feel too large to accept. I had been prepared for an awkward dinner. Bad small talk. Maybe a polite excuse after 40 minutes. I had not been prepared for a woman to sit across from me and talk about a version of myself I couldn't remember being. Sophie took a slow breath. "Before I explain everything, can I ask you something?" I nodded. She looked down at my hands. Then back at my face. "Do you still carry a silver pocket knife?" The air left my lungs. My right hand moved before I could stop it, touching the front pocket of my jeans. The knife was there. It was always there. Small. Silver. Scratched along one side. My father's initials worn almost smooth near the hinge. I had carried it for 15 years. Sophie watched my hand and covered her mouth like the sight had confirmed something she had been afraid to hope for. That was when I realized this wasn't a coincidence. She wasn't here to meet me. She had been looking for me. I kept my hand on my pocket longer than I should have. The silver knife pressed against my fingertips through the denim, small and solid and suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. Sophie noticed. Of course she did. She had noticed everything. My coffee. My old truck. The toy drive. A knife I had carried for years without thinking about it, except on the rare nights when I missed my father and needed to feel something familiar in my hand. I pulled my hand away slowly. "How do you know about that?" I asked. Sophie swallowed. For the first time since she sat down, she looked nervous in a way that had nothing to do with being late. Her eyes moved to the window, where the street lights reflected against the glass. Outside, thin rain had started to fall, silver under the lamps. "I didn't know your name that night," she said. "But I remembered the knife." "That night?" She nodded. "The snowstorm." A strange pressure built behind my ribs. I tried to reach for the memory again. I tried to pull it out clearly, like a box from the top shelf. But all I could find were pieces. A road. Cold wind. Headlights angled wrong. My boots sliding on ice. Nothing complete. Sophie wrapped both hands around her tea, but she didn't drink it. "It was January," she said. 8 years ago. I was driving back from Cardialine after visiting my mother. I was upset before I even got in the car. I remember that part clearly because I kept telling myself I shouldn't drive angry. She let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. "You know when people say they knew something bad was going to happen?" I nodded. "I didn't," she said. "That was the worst part. 1 minute, I was trying to get home. The next, the car slid like the road had disappeared underneath me." Her voice stayed calm, but her fingers tightened around the cup. I hit the guardrail first. Then the car spun. Then everything went white. The cafe suddenly felt too warm. I could almost hear it now. Not her voice. The sound of tires against ice. The hard, sickening crack of metal. Sophie stared down into her tea as if the whole scene was still floating there. When I opened my eyes, I was upside down. The seat belt was cutting into my shoulder. My phone had fallen somewhere I couldn't reach. There was blood on my forehead, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that I was going to die because nobody would see me down there. She looked up at me. Then someone knocked on the window. My mouth went dry. I saw it. Just for half a second. A car half buried off the shoulder. Steam rising from the hood. A young woman inside, trapped and crying, her face pale in the glow of a cracked dashboard light. I shifted in my seat. I stopped, I said quietly. Sophie's eyes softened. You stopped. The words were simple, but the way she said them made them feel like more than words. I rubbed a hand over my jaw. I don't remember everything. I know. No, I mean, I looked away, embarrassed by my own failure. I remember pulling over. I think I called 911. I remember the car was in a ditch. But I don't remember you. Something flickered across her face. Not disappointment exactly. Pain. But controlled pain. The kind people fold neatly before anyone else can see the full shape of it. That makes sense, she said. For you, it was probably just something that happened on a bad road. I wanted to argue. But I couldn't. Because she was right. At least, partly. Back then, I was still married. Still driving that blue Ford pickup with the bad mirror. Still working too many hours and pretending exhaustion was responsibility. I remembered stopping because the road was terrible and someone needed help. I remembered calling emergency services. I remembered being cold. But I didn't remember saving anyone. That word felt too large. I hadn't saved her. I had just stopped. Sophie continued. You couldn't open the driver's side door. It was crushed. You told me not to move my neck. You kept asking me questions so I wouldn't pass out. What questions? She smiled faintly. You asked me my name. My age. Whether I liked coffee. Whether I thought pineapple belonged on pizza. Despite everything, I almost laughed. That sounds like me trying very badly to be helpful. You were helpful. She said it so firmly that I stopped smiling. You gave me your jacket through the broken window because I was shaking so badly. You told me to keep looking at you. Every time I closed my eyes, you tapped the glass and said, Not yet, Sophie. Stay with me. The memory came harder this time. A gloved hand against broken glass. My jacket sleeve catching on a jagged edge. A woman crying because she couldn't feel one of her legs. Me telling her the ambulance was coming even though I kept checking the road and seeing nothing but snow. Sophie's voice dropped. I was terrified. I tried to act like I wasn't, but I was. And you knew. You didn't make a big speech. You just stayed there in the snow, crouched beside that window like there was nowhere else you needed to be. I looked down at my hands. They looked ordinary. Scar across one knuckle from a warehouse accident. Dry skin. Short nails. Hands that counted boxes and lifted pallets and fixed loose hinges. Hands that had apparently held someone's life steady for 20 minutes without remembering the weight of it. When the paramedics came, Sophie said, everything happened fast. They cut the door open. They put a brace around my neck. Someone kept asking if I knew what year it was. I was crying because I thought I had lost something. The knife, I said. She nodded. It was mine. My father gave it to me before he passed. Small silver pocket knife. I used to keep it in my coat, even though I barely used it. My eyebrows pulled together. But the knife I carry was my father's. I know, she said softly. I frowned. Then she reached into her purse. For 1 second, I thought she was going to pull out another knife. Instead, she pulled out an old photograph. The edges were bent. The image was slightly faded. It showed a younger Sophie sitting in a hospital bed, face bruised, wrist wrapped, eyes tired but alive. In her hand was a silver pocket knife. Not mine. Hers. You found it in the snow, she said. You put it in my hand before they loaded me into the ambulance. Then you showed me yours and said your father gave you one too. I stared at the photo. The memory opened a little wider. 2 silver knives. One in her shaking hand. One in mine. A strange little connection in the middle of flashing lights and snow. You said something to me before I left, Sophie whispered. I didn't ask. I already knew she needed to say it. You said, bad days don't last forever. My chest tightened. It sounded like something my father would have said. Something I had probably repeated because I didn't know what else to offer a frightened young woman being lifted into an ambulance. To me, it had been a line. To her, it had become a lifeline. Sophie wiped under one eye quickly, almost angrily, like she hated that the tears had escaped. I never got your name. The hospital wouldn't tell me. The police report just said a male passerby called it in. For years, I wondered if I had imagined parts of it. You didn't, I said. I know that now. There was something in the way she said it that made me uneasy. Something still hidden. I leaned forward slightly. Sophie, why now? She went quiet. The rain outside had grown heavier. It tapped against the cafe window in soft, uneven rhythms. Around us, people kept eating, talking, living their simple Friday nights, unaware that the woman across from me had just handed me a piece of my own past. Sophie took a breath. 6 months after the accident, my fiancé died. The sentence landed so gently I almost missed the damage inside it. I didn't speak. I knew enough about grief to know that some words need space around them. His name was Daniel, she said. He was kind. Funny. The kind of man who remembered small things. He used to tease me because after the accident, whenever I had a terrible day, I would say your sentence out loud. Bad days don't last forever, I said. She nodded. After Daniel died, I didn't believe it anymore. Not for a long time. Her voice cracked at the edges. But I remembered that night. I remembered being trapped in a car, convinced no one was coming. And then a stranger stopped. He didn't know me. He didn't owe me anything. He just stayed. She looked directly at me. And some nights, Jacob, that memory was the only reason I believed the world still had good people in it. I felt something twist inside me. Not pride. Not happiness. Something closer to fear. Because she was looking at me like I had been a lighthouse in a storm, and all I could remember was being a man with cold hands and a borrowed sentence. I'm sorry about Daniel, I said. Thank you. I'm also sorry I don't remember it the way you do. Her face softened. You don't have to. But maybe I should. No, she said quietly. You did what kind people do. Then you went home. That's what made it matter. I didn't know how to accept that. For 8 years, I had thought of myself as ordinary. Maybe less than ordinary after the divorce. A man who could be left. A man whose life could shrink quietly and no one would notice. But Sophie had noticed. Not because I had tried to be remembered. Because one night, in a snowstorm, I had stayed. I looked at the old photograph again. Then back at her. How did you find me? For the first time all night, Sophie's smile faded completely. She folded the photograph back into her purse with careful fingers. And suddenly I understood. Finding me hadn't been an accident. It had started with a promise she made to someone else. Sophie didn't answer right away. She looked past me toward the cafe window, where the rain had turned the street outside into a blur of headlights and reflections. For a moment, I thought she might get up and leave. Not because she wanted to, but because some truths are easier to carry alone than to place in front of another person. Then she reached into her purse again. This time, she pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had been opened and closed so many times that the creases looked permanent. My fiancé knew about you, she said. I stayed quiet. Her thumb moved across the paper like she was smoothing down a memory. Daniel knew everything about that night. The accident. The stranger in the snow. The jacket. The knife. The sentence. Bad days don't last forever, I said. She nodded. At first, he teased me about it. He used to say, one day we're going to find this mystery man and buy him the biggest dinner in Washington. A small smile touched her mouth, but it didn't last. Then he got sick. The cafe noise softened around us again. I had noticed that grief did that. It didn't stop the world. It just made the world feel far away. It was aggressive, Sophie said. By the time they found it, every conversation became careful. Doctors started speaking in percentages. Family members started whispering in hallways. Everyone kept trying to sound hopeful, which somehow made everything worse. She unfolded the paper. I didn't ask to see it. Some things need to be offered before they can be touched. Daniel wrote me letters near the end, she said. Not dramatic goodbye letters. More like instructions for small impossible days. Where the insurance folder was. Which mechanic wouldn't overcharge me. What song he wanted played if I ever got brave enough to dance again. Her voice broke slightly. And one of them said, If you ever find the man from the snowstorm, thank him properly. Not because you owe him your life. Because he reminded you that your life was worth staying for before I ever got the chance to. I looked down at my coffee. It had gone cold. I didn't know what to do with that kind of gratitude. It was too much for one man sitting in a flannel shirt across from a woman he had only known for an hour. I'm sorry, I said. It was all I had. Sophie folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her purse. For years, I searched, she said. Not every day. Not obsessively. But I checked accident reports. I called offices that couldn't tell me anything. I asked hospital staff who weren't allowed to answer. I looked through old community pages. Nothing. Then what changed? My mother. She laughed softly, almost in disbelief. She was reading the local paper 3 weeks ago. There was a photo from a community fundraiser. Some warehouse donated tools and shelving to a youth center. There were volunteers in the background. I already knew before she finished. I remembered that photo. I had hated that photo. A reporter had taken it while I was carrying a box of brackets across the room. I wasn't even supposed to be in it. My face was half-turned, one hand lifted like I was about to tell someone where to put a shelf. My mother called me, Sophie said. She said, I think I found your snowstorm man. The words made my stomach tighten. Snowstorm man. That was not a person. That was a story. And stories are dangerous when real people have to live inside them. Sophie must have seen something change in my face. I know, she said quietly. You know what? That this is a lot. I let out a breath. It's not just a lot, Sophie. I searched for the right words and hated all of them. It feels like you came here expecting someone better than me. Her expression shifted. Not hurt. Not exactly. More like I had finally said the thing she had been waiting for. I didn't come here expecting anything. You said you knew who I was. I knew what you did. That's not the same thing. The words came sharper than I intended. Sophie looked down at the table. I felt guilty immediately. That was another thing divorce teaches you. How quickly a sentence can become a weapon, even when you didn't mean to pick it up. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did, she said. I looked at her. She wasn't angry. That made it worse. You meant that I don't know the real you, she continued. And maybe you're right. But I didn't come here because I thought you were perfect, Jacob. I came because I wanted to thank the person who stayed when I was scared. I wanted to accept that. I really did. But part of me kept resisting. Because the man she remembered had been brave in a snowstorm. The man sitting across from her checked locks twice before bed. Avoided hard conversations. Let his marriage fall apart quietly because fighting for it had felt more humiliating than losing it. Ate leftovers over the sink some nights because setting the table for one felt too sad. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who had been useful once. Still, when Sophie asked if I wanted to walk with her after the rain slowed, I said yes. That was the first mistake. Or maybe it was the first brave thing. We left the cafe an hour later. The rain had faded into mist, and the sidewalks shone under the streetlights. Sophie walked beside me with her hands in her coat pockets, careful not to get too close, careful not to move too far away. We didn't talk about the accident for a while. She told me she worked as a children's librarian. That she loved Story Hour but hated glitter crafts because glitter was, in her words, a permanent life choice. I told her about the warehouse, about drivers who swore they delivered 6 boxes when they delivered 5, about the mysterious way tape guns disappeared like wild animals returning to nature. She laughed. A real laugh. And for the first time that night, I stopped feeling like evidence in someone else's emotional case. Over the next few weeks, we kept seeing each other. Coffee at Birchwood turned into Saturday walks through Riverfront Park. Walks turned into dinners at quiet places where neither of us had to shout over music. She showed me the library after closing one evening, walking me through rows of children's books like each shelf held something sacred. I learned that Sophie touched the spine of a book before pulling it from the shelf. That she always ordered soup if it rained. That she hated being called strong because people usually said it right before asking her to survive something else. She learned that I fixed loose chair legs without being asked. That I didn't like crowds but would stand in one if someone needed me there. That I still kept my old wedding ring in a drawer, not because I wanted my marriage back, but because I didn't know where grief was supposed to go when it was no longer sharp. One Saturday, Sophie invited me to volunteer with her at the community center. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to go. Because being seen beside her felt like stepping into a life I hadn't earned yet. But I went. We sorted donations, assembled shelves, and repaired 2 broken reading tables. Sophie handed out books to children while I tightened screws underneath a wobbly bench. Every now and then, she looked across the room at me, and there was something in her eyes I didn't know how to trust. Admiration, maybe. Or hope. Hope scared me more. That afternoon, I met Noah. He was Sophie's 10-year-old nephew, all elbows, questions, and serious opinions about dinosaurs. He wore a green hoodie with a hole in one sleeve and carried a library card like it was government identification. "So you're Jacob," he said, looking me up and down. "I am. Aunt Sophie said you fix things." "I try." He pointed to a broken wooden book cart in the corner. "Good. That thing has been screaming for 3 weeks." Sophie covered her face with one hand. "Noah." "What?" "It has." I fixed the cart while Noah supervised with the confidence of a tiny building inspector. Sophie watched us from the circulation desk, smiling in a way that made something warm and dangerous open inside my chest. That was how it happened. Not all at once. Not like lightning. More like a room slowly filling with light. But the closer we became, the more I pulled back. When Sophie reached for my hand during a walk, I held it for a minute, then let go to check my phone. When she invited me to Sunday dinner with her mother and Noah, I said I had inventory paperwork, even though the paperwork could have waited. When she looked at me too softly, I made a joke. Because I could feel it happening. She was no longer just the woman from the cafe. And I was terrified she would wake up one day and realize I was not the man from the snowstorm either. One evening, after we closed the library together, Sophie walked me to the front steps. The sky was dark blue, and the air smelled like wet pavement. She stopped beside the railing. "Jacob." "Yeah." "Are you afraid of me?" I shook my head. The truth was worse. I was afraid of disappointing her. I didn't answer Sophie's question right away. We stood outside the library beneath the glow of the street lamp, cold air moving between us. "Are you afraid of me?" I shook my head. The truth was worse. I was afraid of disappointing her. Sophie studied my face for a long moment, the way people do when they're trying to decide whether to ask one more question or let silence do the work instead. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." She didn't push. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made me feel seen. We walked to our cars together that night. Before getting in, Sophie touched my arm gently. "Jacob." "Yeah." "I don't expect you to be the man from that night." I frowned. "You don't?" She smiled sadly. "He was a stranger standing in the snow for 20 minutes. Her eyes held mine. "I want to know the man standing in front of me now." Then she got into her car and drove away. I stood in the empty parking lot long after her taillights disappeared. Because part of me realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't afraid she loved a memory. I was afraid she would stop. Over the next 2 weeks, things changed. Not all at once. Just enough to notice. Texts that usually came in the morning started arriving late at night. Coffee dates became maybe next week. Phone calls got shorter. Every time I asked if everything was okay, Sophie gave the same answer. "Just busy." People say that word like it's harmless. Busy. As if it explains exhaustion. As if it isn't sometimes another way of saying, "I'm drowning, but I don't know how to ask for help." I recognized it because I used to say it all the time. One Tuesday evening, I stopped by the library with takeout from Sophie's favorite Thai place. She hadn't answered my last 2 messages. I told myself I was just being thoughtful. Not worried. Definitely not worried. The library lights were off except for a small lamp behind the front desk. I found Sophie in her office. She looked up when I knocked lightly against the open door. For a second, Relief crossed her face. Then it disappeared. Her smile looked tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired. There were folders spread across her desk. Insurance forms. Medical records. Sticky notes covered in rushed handwriting. What happened? I asked. Sophie rubbed her eyes. My mom collapsed at home yesterday. Every thought in my head stopped. Is she okay? She's stable. Stable. Another word people use when they don't know whether things are actually okay. I pulled out the chair beside her desk. What did the doctors say? Heart issues. Medication complications. They want more tests. She let out a breath. And Noah's school called this morning because he forgot his lunch again. Who's Noah with? My sister works nights now. Mom usually picks him up after school, but she can't drive. She laughed softly. The sound carried no humor. I spent my lunch break arguing with an insurance company while trying to explain fractions to a 10-year-old. I looked at the stack of papers. Then at her. When did you sleep? She didn't answer. That was answer enough. Over the next few days, Sophie started canceling plans completely. Not because she wanted to. Because she had run out of space. Hospital appointments. Medication schedules. School pickups. Grocery lists. Homework. Laundry. Life. One Thursday night, she finally texted me. I can't do this right now. The words sat on my screen like a warning light. My chest tightened. A second message appeared. My mom needs me. Noah needs me. I barely have enough energy to keep everything moving. Then, I don't want you feeling responsible for all this. I read the messages 3 times. People leave relationships for a lot of reasons. Sometimes because they don't care enough. Sometimes because they care too much. I knew which one this was. I drove to Grace's house Saturday morning. Not to argue. Not to convince Sophie to stay. Just to drop off groceries. That's what I told myself anyway. The front porch railing was loose. One of the shutters hung crooked. The mailbox leaned so far to one side it looked tired. Inside, Noah sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Grace rested on the couch under a blanket. Sophie stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at an open cabinet like she had forgotten what she needed. When she saw me, surprise flashed across her face. Then frustration. Then guilt. Jacob, you didn't have to come. I set the grocery bags on the counter. I know. She crossed her arms. You really don't have to keep doing this. I glanced toward the porch window. When was the last time somebody fixed that railing? She blinked. What? The railing. It's loose. Sophie looked exhausted enough to cry over a sentence about home repairs. Jacob. And the mailbox needs replacing. Please stop. I did. Immediately. Noah looked up from the table. Grace watched us quietly. Sophie lowered her voice. I can't ask you to carry this. I stepped closer. You're not asking. That's the problem. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked angry. Not at me. At herself. At the impossible math of trying to be enough for everyone. I understood that feeling. After my divorce, I spent years believing needing help was the same thing as failing. Maybe Sophie believed that too. So I changed the subject. I fixed the railing. Then I replaced the mailbox. The next morning, I drove Noah to school because Sophie had an appointment with Grace's cardiologist. That afternoon, I sat beside her in the hospital cafeteria while she tried to untangle insurance paperwork. I made lists. Called numbers. Asked questions. That evening, I cooked dinner because the refrigerator contained 3 yogurts, mustard, and expired orange juice. Nothing grand. Nothing cinematic. Just practical things. The kind of things that quietly tell someone they aren't alone. For 2 weeks, I kept showing up. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes with coffee. Sometimes with nothing except extra time. I never asked where we stood. I never asked if she still wanted this. Because love isn't always a candlelit dinner. Sometimes it's knowing where the spare batteries are. Sometimes it's remembering which pharmacy stays open late. Sometimes it's sitting in a waiting room without talking because talking takes energy nobody has left. One night, after Noah had fallen asleep and Grace was resting upstairs, Sophie found me washing dishes. She leaned against the kitchen doorway. There were shadows under her eyes. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. She looked exhausted. And beautiful. Not despite it. Because she had spent weeks carrying impossible things and was still standing. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. I turned off the faucet. "Doing what?" "All of it." I dried my hands slowly. Because I wanted to answer carefully. Not with something that sounded rehearsed. Not with a speech. Just the truth. "You don't owe me anything, Sophie." Her eyes filled immediately. I stepped closer. "I'm here because I want to be." For a second, she didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't look away. Then something inside her finally gave out. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. "Jacob." Sophie cried like someone who had been holding her breath for months. At first, she tried to stop it. She covered her face with both hands and turned away from me, like even her tears needed to apologize for taking up space. I didn't touch her right away. I had learned that some people needed comfort, and some people first needed permission to fall apart. So I stood there in Grace's kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the sink, listening to the quiet sound of her breaking. The house was still around us. Upstairs, Grace slept behind a half-closed bedroom door. Down the hallway, Noah's dinosaur nightlight glowed faintly from his room. A pot of soup cooled on the stove. The dishes were clean. The paperwork was stacked. Everything looked handled. But Sophie wasn't. She lowered her hands slowly. Her cheeks were wet. Her eyes were red. Her mouth trembled in a way that made her look younger than she was. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Do what?" She looked at me. "Let someone stay." I didn't answer. Because I knew exactly what she meant. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, then gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I spent years wanting to find you. I thought if I found you, I could finally close that chapter. Thank you. Tell you what you meant. Let that night stop following me." Her voice shook. "But now you're here, and you're not a chapter. You're a person. You show up with groceries. You fix railings. You remember Noah hates peas. You sit with my mother when she's scared." She looked away. And I don't know where gratitude ends and love begins. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they hurt. Because they were honest. I looked down at the floor between us. For weeks, I had been afraid of the same thing from the other side. Afraid that Sophie loved what I represented. Afraid that the snowstorm had turned me into something cleaner than I was. Afraid that if she saw me long enough, close enough, tired enough, flawed enough, the mystery would disappear and leave disappointment behind. "I've spent years believing people eventually leave," I said. Sophie looked back at me. The confession surprised both of us. So I kept going before I could take it back. After my divorce, I told myself I was fine. I went to work. Paid bills. Fixed things. Kept busy. But the truth is, I started living like everything good was temporary. My throat tightened. So when you looked at me like I mattered, I didn't trust it. I thought sooner or later, you'd realize I was just ordinary. Sophie's face softened. "Jacob." "No, let me finish." I breathed out slowly. "You were scared you only loved me because I helped you once. I was scared you only loved me because you didn't really know me." The kitchen went quiet. And there it was. The thing neither of us had wanted to say. We had both been protecting ourselves from the same fear. That love built during pain might not survive peace. Sophie opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a soft voice came from the hallway. "She knows you." Grace stood near the doorway in her robe, one hand braced gently against the wall. Sophie turned quickly. "Mom, you should be resting." Grace waved her off. "I have been resting for 2 weeks. I'm tired of resting." I stepped forward. "Do you need help?" "I need both of you to stop talking like frightened people pretending to be practical." Sophie blinked. Even in her exhaustion, Grace carried the calm authority of a woman who had survived enough to speak plainly. She looked at her daughter first. Sophie, gratitude doesn't make you laugh when he burns toast. Gratitude doesn't make you save the last piece of pie because you know he likes the crust. Gratitude doesn't make you look at the door every time a truck pulls up outside. Sophie's eyes filled again. Then Grace turned to me. And you? I straightened slightly without meaning to. Grace smiled faintly. She stopped searching for the man who saved her weeks ago. My chest tightened. Grace's voice became softer. She fell in love with the man sitting in front of her. No one moved. Sophie looked at her mother like the words had taken something private and placed it gently in the light. I didn't know where to look. At Sophie. At Grace. At the floor. At the life forming around me that I had been too afraid to reach for fully. Grace touched Sophie's arm. Now, I'm going back to bed before both of you make me listen to another 10 minutes of emotional nonsense. Sophie laughed through her tears. So did I. But after Grace disappeared down the hallway, the laughter faded, and the truth stayed. Sophie and I stood facing each other in the kitchen. Not as a woman who owed me anything. Not as a man trying to live up to one good night. Just two people with tired hearts, standing in the middle of a house that had needed help and somehow become the place where we finally stopped hiding. I took one step closer. Sophie. She looked up. I almost didn't ask. Because some questions change the room before anyone answers them. But I needed to know. Not for my pride. For both of us. If we'd never met that night in the snow, I said, if there had never been an accident, no jacket, no pocket knife, no sentence you remembered for 8 years. Her lips parted slightly. I forced myself to finish. Would you still choose me? Sophie didn't answer quickly. And somehow, that made it mean more. She looked at me like she was seeing all of it at once. The man in the snow. The man at the cafe. The man washing dishes in her mother's kitchen. The man who was afraid. The man who stayed anyway. Then she stepped closer. I choose you now. My chest ached. Not because of what you did then. She shook her head. Because of who you are now. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All the defenses I had carried for years felt suddenly useless. The quiet apartment. The failed marriage. The belief that ordinary meant unworthy. Sophie saw all of it. And she stayed. I reached for her hand. Slowly. Carefully. Giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers slipped into mine. Warm. Steady. Real. This time, neither of us pulled away. 6 months later, life still wasn't easy. Grace still had doctor's appointments twice a month. Noah still forgot where he left his homework at least once a week. Sophie still carried too much in her head and not enough in her planner. And I still worked at the warehouse, arguing with delivery drivers about missing boxes and wondering who kept stealing the tape guns. Some things don't change. The difference was that none of us carried those things alone anymore. Most Sunday evenings, we had dinner at Grace's house. Nothing fancy. Spaghetti. Tacos. Pot roast if Grace was feeling ambitious. Noah set the table with the seriousness of a restaurant manager inspecting his staff. Sophie made fun of my inability to cut vegetables evenly. Grace pretended not to notice when Noah slid the peas from his plate onto mine. The house sounded different now. Less like a place recovering. More like a place living again. Grace was getting stronger. Slowly. The kind of slowly you only notice when you stop expecting miracles and start appreciating ordinary progress. She had more energy. Her laugh came easier. Some mornings, she walked to the mailbox without needing to sit down afterward. Noah called it her comeback tour. She called it stubbornness. Sophie and I kept volunteering together at the community center. Every other Saturday, we'd sort donations, assemble shelves, and organize reading corners for kids. The first time we went back after everything that had happened, Sophie slipped her hand into mine without thinking. I don't think she realized she had done it. I noticed. And I didn't let go. Noah started teaching me card games. Apparently, there are dozens of rules that change depending on who is losing. Mostly me. He accused me of bluffing even when I wasn't. Sophie accused him of inventing rules. Grace accused both of us of taking the competition too seriously. For the first time in years, I stopped eating dinner alone. Stopped leaving the television on just to fill silence. Stopped treating my apartment like a waiting room for a life that wasn't happening. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Sophie and I helped Grace clean out an old dresser in the guest room. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor beside us, sorting old photographs into piles labeled important and very important. His categories changed every 5 minutes. I opened the bottom drawer and found an old wooden box. Inside were spare keys, faded receipts, batteries that probably didn't work anymore, and my silver pocket knife. I'd taken it out weeks earlier while helping Grace repair a cabinet hinge and forgotten to put it back in my pocket. Noah picked it up carefully. "Why do you always carry this thing?" I looked at the knife. The silver had worn dull over the years. My father's initials were still etched near the hinge. For a moment, I saw everything at once. A dark road. Falling snow. A frightened young woman trapped inside a car. A crowded cafe. A whispered sentence. A life-changing direction because two people happened to cross paths at the exact moment they needed each other. Before I could answer, Sophie smiled. Because some small things change your whole life. Noah looked between us. Then he nodded like that made perfect sense. Kids understand things adults spend years overcomplicating. Later that evening, after Noah went upstairs to show Grace his newest card trick, Sophie and I sat together on the back porch. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet pine and cold earth. Our shoulders touched. Her hand rested in mine so naturally now that it felt strange remembering a time when it didn't. I looked out across the backyard. At the garden Grace had started planting again. At the porch light reflecting off the damp grass. At the ordinary life unfolding around us. Then I looked at Sophie. "Do you still think you know who I am?" She turned toward me. The corners of her eyes crinkled when she smiled. She squeezed my hand gently. "No." I laughed softly. "No." She shook her head. "I know who you're becoming." Something inside me settled when she said that. Because she was right. The man she met in the snowstorm had been a stranger. The man she met at the cafe had been afraid. But the man sitting beside her now was learning that love wasn't about being extraordinary. It was about showing up. Again and again. Even on ordinary days. Especially on ordinary days. I used to think being remembered meant doing something extraordinary. But sometimes the moments that change your life are the ones you barely notice. A stopped car. A borrowed jacket. A few kind words in the middle of a storm. And sometimes love begins with a stranger sitting across from you and whispering, "I know who you are." If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know in the comments. Has someone ever changed your life with a simple act of kindness? We'd love to hear your story. And if you believe real love is about showing up when life gets hard, please like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the smallest moments can change everything.